All right, so this is Unit 5, which was cognition, and that included memory, intelligence, and problem solving. So it's a long section, and really I put almost all the slides in here because since this was from the very beginning of the year, I figured you probably forgot a lot of it. So, but there's 3 steps in the memory information processing model. There's encoding, storage, and retrieval. The Atkinson-Shiffrin model says there's 3 stages of memory: sensory memory, short-term memory, and long-term memory. Some information skips, and if it's like really significant, or sometimes it's even not really significant, but sometimes it just goes straight to long-term memory. But we generally select what is important and process it from working memory. Working memory is what used to really be called short-term memory, but they're the same thing. Working and short-term memory, it's active, it's conscious, and it's you basically pulling information out of your memory store. Disorders that affect working memory: schizophrenia, because it's distorted memory, and then Alzheimer's, that keeps you from retrieving memories. That those are both affecting working memory. Some things we process automatically, like space, where things are located; time, when things happened; and frequency, how often they happen to you. Lots of things take effort. So memory requires effort and it can lead to durable and accessible memories. However, we know that just because you made a lot of effort doesn't mean you're guaranteed to remember it, because sometimes you'll spend forever studying something and you still forget it. But encoding is divided between effortful and automatic processing. Our main person that we associate with memory is Hermann Ebbinghaus. He studied effortful learning by rehearsing nonsense syllables, and he used nonsense syllables so they were things that didn't have any other kind of personal connection, like how hard would it be to actually remember things. He found that when we rehearse things, it takes fewer repetitions to remember them later on. So these are all things that we have learned before earlier in the year, so they're not going to take as long for us to remember them now. Some different memory effects. The spacing effect says we do better when we rehearse over time. So we are cramming now, but we've also learned these things from throughout the year. And then the serial position effect says when we're talking about a list, the things that were at the beginning and the end of the list, we remember better, but the middle, we don't remember. Hopefully all of this is kind of coming back. The primacy effect says we remember the beginning of the list because you rehearsed it more, that we talked about it more. And like these things, they were from the beginning of the year, but we've talked about some of these things throughout the year. And then the recency effect says, yeah, the stuff at the end of a list, you still remember because it's in your short-term memory. So this just graphically showing the stuff at the beginning and the stuff at the end, we remember more than the stuff in the middle. How do we encode? We encode by meaning, which we call semantic; by images, that's iconic; by how we organize it, like in hierarchies or chunks; and by sound, which is acoustic. Semantic, again, is by meaning; acoustic, sound; visual is iconic. Generally, semantic encoding works best. When you understand what something means, you're going to remember it more than just what it looked like or what it sounded like. We tried to incorporate all of it. So you did flipped videos, you watched it and you heard it and you were learning the meaning at the same time. You did an IVN where you were focusing on meaning and visual stuff. You talked in your family groups, your psych families, and that was acoustic. So hopefully you've been learning information really well all year because you've not just been using one type of encoding. You're not just, reading a book. You've got all these other types here. Some other levels of processing: shallow versus deep processing. Shallow processing is just structural, like what kind of font was it written in? What did it look like? Did it have capital letters? Deep processing is another word for semantic encoding, that you actually understand the verbal input. And then phonemic, like auditory, is just kind of in the middle. In general, semantic encoding, again, is the strongest or deepest level of encoding. Some other things, we talked about the self-reference effect, that we remember things that relate to us more personally. Let's see, this is just semantic encoding, that when we know we have knowledge about it, we elaborate more about it. If we watch like a video about it, like a specific case study, you remember those things because we added more elaboration to it. Mental pictures and imagery can be very powerful, which is why we do the IVN. And that's why we did this at the beginning of the year to kind of explain why we do the IVN. So that's why go back and look at your IVN. You drew those pictures. Some of them were personal to you. Some of you remember Googling them, but hopefully you remember spending some time coloring them. All that visual encoding will help. Some other things, the next in line effect, we tend not to remember things when we're waiting in line when we're next because we're thinking about ourselves. We don't pay attention to what's happening right before us. Information that is learned right before you fall asleep, we don't remember it because remember, it has to have time to go from short-term memory to long-term memory. So if you put it in your short-term memory and then you go to sleep, it didn't have time to get to long-term memory. So if you're studying before bed, you need to have some downtime before you go to sleep so that information has a little bit of time to process. Taped information while asleep does not usually register and we don't remember it. So don't play recordings of my flipped notes and the review videos while you're sleeping. One, that's weird. And two, it's not going to work. Motivation to remember says that generally when we put more effort during encoding, we're more likely to remember it. It has to happen during the encoding part, not like when you're trying to retrieve it, like, oh, I need to really remember this now. It has to be when you're encoding it. Like, this is super important for me to remember. Again, the spacing effect, we encode better when we study out our spacing over time. We said don't cram, but yes, cramming is better than nothing. So cramming is better than no studying at all. Generally, the stuff that we studied that was spaced out, we remember better than massed practice, which is our fancy word for cramming. Tricks for encoding using mnemonic devices. That's when we're adding like letters to relate to it. But mnemonic devices can include visual imagery, the peg word system, method of loci, acronyms, and elaboration. We'll look at each of those. The peg word system is where you memorize a list of pegs like oven, couch, bed, and then you relate each of the things you're trying to remember to your pre-memorized pegs. Method of loci, remember we said it's also called the memory palace. It's where you're memorizing things with location. So if you're trying to memorize the brain parts, we said study each brain part in a different room of your house. And then later on, you would associate those rooms with the brain parts. Or if you're giving a speech, which is what the Greek orators used to do, is they would memorize their speech at different places around a palace. And then when they had to recall it, they would recall those different places. Let's see. Helping to, or when you break down the information and how you organize it, that helps you to remember it in chunks or hierarchies. So when we break down things into groups, like when we remember phone numbers or your social security number, those are chunked, and that helps us to remember them better. Acronyms are when we relate the first letter of each word and then they form a word, like Holmes for Huron, Ontario, Michigan, Erie, Superior, or Roy G. Biv, or PEMDAS, or however you remember the planets. A hierarchy, again, when we put complex information into categories and we further subdivide it, that helps us to encode it and to remember it a little bit better. So encoding in a hierarchy, we've got meaning, imagery, organization, and we can organize into chunks or hierarchies. All right, retaining the information or the storage part of it. So again, there's the sensory working memory and long-term memory. So where you're storing it there kind of matters. The delay between when you sense it and when you encode it, it goes away very quickly. So just like less than a second often. You have to do something to either keep watching it or keep hearing it or encode it to store it. So iconic memories are very short. Echoic, you hear it, it'll last a little bit longer. And hepatic, also less than a second. So like if somebody tells you their name and then they start talking about other stuff and then you get to the end and you're like, what was your name? It's because you didn't encode it. You heard it and then you started listening to the other stuff. All right, working memory. George Miller is the one who said that our working memory or short-term memory has a capacity of 7 plus or minus 2 items. He called it the magical number 7 for his book. And that's only for about 20 to 30 seconds. If you want to keep it, you have to do more to encode it after that. So that working memory duration is only about 20 seconds. Let's see. So we have rapid decay when there's no rehearsal. So if you learn something, you hear something, you see something, if you don't do anything to retain it, it goes away super fast. Some other things that go with working memory, we have a phonological loop that when you recite or rethink things over and over, we tend to keep it. So phonological loop is just when you're like keep repeating things in your mind. Let's see, visual spatial sketch pad. We have the ability to temporarily hold and manipulate visual images. So like when you open the refrigerator and you see what's in there, and then you're like visualizing, what can I make out of this? Or you're staring at your clothes in your closet and you're mentally planning out your outfits. That's the visual spatial sketch pad. Central executive system is the idea that our brain, this system is in charge of directing and dividing our focus and attention. So we talked about like maybe you're doing your homework and watching TV and your phone is there. So your brain is deciding like what percentage of your attention goes to each of those things. You hear something interesting on the TV, that gets more attention. A text message pops up on your phone, that gets more attention. So that's the central executive system. And then episodic buffer is what kind of decides what makes it from short-term memory to long-term memory. And then long-term memory essentially has an unlimited capacity store. So you can keep shoving stuff into your brain. You can keep getting that information into your long-term memory. The problem is with retrieval. Let's see, that's just our capacity stores. Elizabeth Loftus is the one who studied memories in the brain, and she's found, and then for some other studies, that memories are stored in multiple places throughout the brain. Remember that the memories are in the cortex, and that the cortex, the lobes, we have touch sensations, visual sensations, smell, auditory, and each parts of that memory are stored in different parts of your brain. So I think we talked about like the memory of your first kiss, the touch sensations in the parietal lobe. If there was music playing, the auditory part of that memory is in your temporal lobe. Your decision-making process and all the thinking about it was in the frontal lobe. So stored in lots of places. Long-term potentiation is the idea that the more often you recall a memory, that synapse gets stronger. So your brain literally gets stronger by strengthening the synapse and releasing more neurotransmitters when you study. Because it's recalling that memory more often, it adds more neurotransmitters there. And it would probably be acetylcholine, because acetylcholine is one of the main ones that ties in with memory. Dopamine as well. All right, let's see. Storing our memories. So for long-term memories, we have two main types, explicit and implicit memories. Explicit, we also call declarative, because you can consciously declare those. They are processed by the hippocampus. Those are things like all your facts and general knowledge. All the stuff we're talking about today, that's explicit memories. But also episodic memories, personally experienced events. Oh, this is a better slide for it. So memory of your first birthday, memory of what you ate for breakfast. You don't remember your first birthday, your 16th birthday or your 15th birthday if you're not there yet. Episodic memories also count as flashbulb memories. Who sent an e-hall pass? I can't see it. So where are you going? Restroom? Okay, tell me you sent an e-hall pass. Dang it. Hold on. I got to pause it and approve it or else the nurse won't see it. Okay. So episodic are memories of your own life. Intense memories, those are called flashbulb memories because they're tied to emotions. Implicit memories are the other type of long-term memories. We also call them procedural memories. These are things you can do without conscious recall, like tying your shoes, writing your name. When we were at our Stuco trip, somebody like didn't remember putting their Apple Watch on and was freaking out. They're like, I can't find my Apple Watch. I lost it. It's in the room. And it was literally on her hand. So it was a procedural memory. It was an implicit memory. She didn't even think about putting it on. She just does it. Those are processed by the cerebellum. It was funny, but also annoying. So any kind of skills, but also classical and operant conditioning effects, those are implicit memories. So riding a bike, so knowing the names of the parts of the bike, that's explicit. Knowing how to actually ride the bike, that is implicit. Stress hormones, we talked about flashbulb memories. Whenever we have heightened emotions, really happy, really sad, really scary, hormones increase the memory, and that's a type of episodic memory. We got those there. All right, so again, the hippocampus is the part that forms the explicit memories. The cerebellum helps form implicit memories. But remember, memories are not stored in those. They're stored throughout the cortex. All right, retro versus antro. We had several terms here that go with those prefixes. Antrograde amnesia. Antro means after. So this is when you cannot remember things from after the damage. Antrograde amnesia. We talked about Clive Waring. He had antrograde amnesia and he couldn't remember things from after he had brain damage. So no new memories. They can still retain implicit memories. This person, HM, he couldn't remember learning how to do the Tower of Hanoi, this little little mental puzzle game that you do. But he knew how to do it because procedurally he could form the memory. But if you asked him, do you know how to do it? He's like, I don't know how to do this. And they're like, well, just try. And he knew how. We might watch. I watched some of this the other day. It was on TV. 51st Dates, really good movie about retrograde amnesia. Retrograde amnesia is where you can't remember things prior to the brain injury. So you wake up and you don't know your name. You don't know where you are because you can't remember the past. Let's see, retrospective memory. Again, retro is past. Anything from the past you can't remember. Prospective is remembering to perform actions in the future. Remembering that you have your AP test on Tuesday. Remembering that you want to eat a good breakfast that day. Remembering to finish your case studies tonight. Those are all prospective memories. They're for the future. All right, when we're measuring memory, there's different types. Recognition is just where you identify something amongst other choices. Let's see, and I took out recall, but recall is when you have to like consciously remember it without a stimulus. Most of the AP test is recognition because it's multiple choice, so that's good. Relearning, we relearn things faster the second time. Thank goodness. All right, our brain is like a giant spider web of associations, and retrieval cues are what help us to remember things. So you hear something, you're like, oh, that reminded me of another story. And then I tell you something else, you're like, oh, that reminded me of this. I haven't thought of that in a long time. And that's because those are retrieval cues, that our memories are all tied together by similar things. And you hear one thing, it retrieves the other. Priming is when you get a hint and it activates a concept. So seeing or hearing the word rabbit activates a concept of like a picture of a rabbit, and it primes spelling the spoken word hair or hair. But priming is like if I give you a hint, like it starts with C or it rhymes with this, that's priming. Reality monitoring and retrieval. Reality monitoring is when you're trying to decide, did this really happen or did I dream this? Was it internal? Did I actually do that or did I just think about it? Let's see. Source monitoring is when you're trying to remember where the memory came from. Did you learn it from scrolling on TikTok? Did you learn it while watching Flipped Notes? Did somebody tell you that story? So source monitoring is trying to determine where the memory actually came from. Destination memory involves recalling to whom one has told what. And I have this problem as a teacher because I can't remember, did I tell this to this class? Did I tell it to the other class? And that's why we say tell the truth. So you don't have to remember different versions of the story and remember which version you told who. Deja vu, where you feel like you've experienced before, we said it's usually considered to be a lag in memory processing. So yes, you have felt it before, like a microsecond earlier, that there seems to be some kind of a delay in processing. Context effects. So these are called state-dependent memories. So this basically says that we recall things better where we learned them. In the experiment, people learned a list of words underwater, and when they had to recall the words, they did better underwater than when they were like on the boat. We talked about how ideally you should take your AP test in this classroom because you've learned so many things in here. They don't let us, but that would be ideal. It's not big enough for all of us. Context, same thing. So context effects, state-dependent memory is a type of context effect. Another one that goes with that is mood-dependent memory, also called mood congruent, that we recall other times when we're in the same mood. So when you're sad, you remember all the other sad things. I was talking to Evan this morning. I was upset and then remember all the other things that upset me, and it just like pulled my mood down. I'm better now. But when you're happy, you remember other happy times, and when you're like surprised, you remember other surprise times. So that's mood dependent, mood congruent. Forgetting. So why do we forget? It's mainly because of you can't retrieve the memory. So that's either because you poor encoding, storage, or retrieval problems. So encoding failure, if you're like, I don't remember this, well, maybe you never did that section of flip notes, so you never encoded the memory. Ebbinghaus showed us with his forgetting curve that memories decay very quickly, that retention drops very quickly, but then it levels off at around 20%. You're not there right now. Right now, you're still recalling everything. But like things from like a class that you had in middle school, you probably remember about 20% of that unless you're still actively using the information. That happens a lot with like foreign languages. When you learn a foreign language in school and you don't remember all of it, it's about 20%. Over time, we recognize things better. That's why, like, if you saw like signs in Spanish, it'd be better than if you actually had to, speak Spanish, because then you would have to recall the words on your own. All right. Other retrieval failures, tip of the tongue phenomenon. It's right there, but you can't quite access it. Interference. This will be in the confusing pairs that we review, if I have time to review those, because it's two of the most common things. So proactive interference is when you can't remember the new information because old information is interfering. So proactive, you can't remember the new. Like you can't remember your new girlfriend's name and you accidentally call her the old girlfriend's name. Retroactive interference is when you can't remember the old stuff because the new is interfering. So now you've learned your new locker combination, but you can't remember your old locker combination. So the acronym we used for that, and this, for me, it doesn't work. I just remember it the way I just said it. But PORN, we said proactive old affects the recall of new. Retroactive new affects the recall of old. A lot of people do, one of the test taking strategies is to do a brain dump. Like as soon as you open your test, write something down. And a lot of kids write this acronym down, like PORN, and they are like proactive and retroactive. Like they write those two down in case it's on the test and they just remembered it. All right, let's see. Retroactive interference, if you get more sleep, you're less likely to forget the old stuff. Other types of forgetting, Freud talked about repression. The misinformation effect from Elizabeth Loftus says we have a tendency to incorporate misleading information into our memories of events. Her experiment was the one where she showed people pictures of a wreck and then asked them later how much glass was there or how fast were the cars going when they hit each other versus when they smashed into each other. And the ones who heard smashed into reported seeing more glass and thinking that they were going faster. So it incorporated misleading information by how she said it. Source amnesia, when you can't remember where the information came from. And if you say like, oh, I saw this on the news and actually somebody told it to you, that would be misattribution. All right. Oh, that was a long section. So part 4 is on language. We talked about stages of language development. There's the babbling stage, about 4 months. 1 word stage, which usually happens right around 1 year old. We talked about when kids turn 1 year old, by then they're usually speaking in 1 word phrases. The 2 word phrase happens about 2 years old, and they speak in things like telegraphic speech, like go car means I would like to go for a ride in the car. And then by after 2 years old, they're speaking in longer phrases. Fast mapping. This is the idea that children will learn a word after just 1 exposure. A lot of times it's a bad word, but sometimes it's other words. So toddlers often make errors in using new words. Overextension is when they use 1 word and it means a lot of things. So they say doggy and they mean all animals, or they say ball and they mean anything round, like a piece of fruit. Underextension is the opposite. They use a word, but they only mean 1 specific one. So they say doll, but they don't mean any doll. They just mean their favorite doll. Let's see. Overgeneralization, sometimes called overregularization. We said this is when they overuse a grammar rule, like saying, I goed to the store. Mama taked the clothes out of the dryer. We said that's a positive error for new learners because it shows they're picking up on the rules of grammar, like adding ed to make something past tense. How do we learn language? There's different theories. Skinner says we learn it by rewards and associations. That's the behaviors perspective. That little kid says a word and everybody's like, oh, they said their first words. And then you keep doing it. That's the behaviors perspective. Noam Chomsky said, oh, we don't have time to reward everybody. So there must be a natural ability to learn language too. And he called that the language acquisition device, our inborn ability to learn language. I think these are all IVN terms, by the way. Hopefully you remember, you'll go back and look at these. Remember, the LAD is not an actual brain part. It's just the idea that you have this inborn ability to learn language. That's that nativist perspective. Let's see. And then the social interactionist theory basically says it's both, that it's both inborn and by learning language from your environment. We talked about Lev Vygotsky, and that also goes with the interactionist, and this was in another chapter, also the development chapter, that again, there's what a child can do on their own. They're going to learn language as long as they're hearing stuff. But if you are speaking to them really well and you talk to them and they hear more things they're exposed to, they're going to do better. That's the zone of proximal development. But if you're trying to teach them how to speak Latin when they're like an infant or a toddler, they're just not ready for that. And then that's inappropriate. They'll have self-esteem issues. But talk to your kids, make them smart. My child speaks well. I spoke to her a lot when she was little. I mean, I still do. All right, there's those theories again. All right, we talked about the idea of a critical period for certain development things, primarily language, that if you never are exposed to language by about age 7, you lose that ability. And that's because your brain goes through synaptic pruning, that when you get older, it gets rid of those early neural connections. Our example of that was the case of Jeannie, the little girl who was locked up to a potty chair for 13 years and nobody talked to her and she never learned language. This is also evidenced by people who immigrate to new countries and try to learn new languages. It is much more difficult for them to pick up on a new language after age 7. Let's see some properties of language. Language is symbolic, that we have letters. It's semantic, that we can generate, or that it has meaning, that sounds and phrases have meaning. Generative, that we can create lots of new words, and that it's structured. We have rules. Phonemes are the smallest speech unit. Morphemes are the smallest unit of meaning. Semantics are the meanings, and syntax is grammar. So in a word like goal, it has 3 phonemes: g, ol, ul. Then if we have the word player, it has 2 morphemes: play and and then the other one, semantic, is the meaning of the word and sentence. Syntax is any kind of grammar rules, like putting the adjective first in English. Let's see. All right, some more. Language influences thinking. The linguistic relativity hypothesis, also called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, says that language determines the way we think. So, for example, Eskimo think about snow a lot, so they have way more words for snow. Linguistic determinism takes it a step farther, and it actually says that language determines how we see the world, that we can't see things another way when we don't have words for it. And he said that the Eskimo can actually perceive snow differently because they know so many words for snow. This is just like white, icy stuff, but they can differentiate between all the types of snow because that language, they have the language for it. Thinking, our fancy word for thinking is cognition. So when we think, we tend to picture things in prototypes. When someone says triangle, your first thought is usually a triangle like this. When somebody says bird, you often think of like a regular, like a songbird, but you probably don't picture a penguin or an ostrich because you think in prototypes. We solve problems, trial and error. You just try one thing, doesn't work, you try something else. An algorithm is when you try to solve a problem by considering every possible solution. Usually computers do this. It takes longer, but you're going to get a right answer. Instead, we use a heuristic. A heuristic is a shortcut. Like we talked about, like if you're looking for duck sauce, you're going to go to the Asian section instead of maybe starting where ketchup is. Representative heuristic is you take your shortcut by your prototype. So when somebody says you meet a slim short man who wears glasses and likes poetry, are they a professor or a truck driver? That fits your prototype for professor. However, statistically, it's much more likely they're a truck driver just because there's way more truck drivers out there in the world. But we base our opinion off of a prototype. Like you see this person, is he a criminal or a librarian? He might be a librarian, but he fits your prototype of what a criminal might look like. Availability heuristic, you base your information off of what's most recently or easily available. So most people overestimate the number of violent crimes in an area because they watch the news and that's what they talk about. So they hear crime. So they often base their information off of the wrong stuff. Availability heuristic, this also has to do with like how you pick your colleges, that your family all talks about A&M or UT, or your teachers talk about a certain school. You're more likely to be swayed to those because that information is more readily available to you. Insight, we talked about in a previous section. I'll skip that. Problem solving, or obstacles in problem solving. Confirmation bias. Information, you only search for information that confirms your view. Fixation, when you think there's only like one way to fix something, you're stuck on one way. So you overcome that with overcoming functional fixedness. So for example, when you're finding new ways to do something, like using my Christmas tree as a graduation tree, that's overcoming functional fixedness. Like thinking, oh, the only way I can use it as a Christmas tree, but I do something different every season. This one, they've got a rake and it's holding jewelry. That's overcoming functional fixedness. This hot dog one looks gross to me, but you could do that too. All right, mental set is when we tend to do things the same way because it worked in the past. It may not have been the best way, but it's the way we do it. We talked about mom makes her turkey the same way every year. It's not great, but everybody eats it, so she keeps doing it that way. Mental set. Gambler's fallacy is you believe that the odds of something are going to go up because it hasn't happened in a while. but really your odds are still the same. Like a family that has 5 boys, they're sure mom's going to have a girl next time because she hasn't had a boy yet. But the chances are still 50-50 that she's going to have a boy or a girl because there's 2 options there. So her odds have not actually changed. The conjunction fallacy, we tend to assume that specific conditions are more probable than general ones. So we think of something, this one's too hard to explain in a hurried time, so I'm going to skip it. Overconfidence, we know what that means. Exaggerated fears. Framing, when you word things in a different way. If you're trying to buy beef and it says it's 80% lean and 20% fat, you're like, oh, that sounds healthier. Or if you want to market it and you're like, and you focus on the fat, then you're like, oh, 20% sounds a lot. Belief perseverance, your tendency to cling to evidence or cling to a belief even when there's contrary evidence. Like people who think the earth is flat and everyone's like, there's all this evidence that says it's not, but they still cling to it even though there's other evidence, and they go with that confirmation bias. They just look for evidence that supports their view. Divergent thinking, you generate many unique ideas. And then convergent thinking, you narrow them down to one. Oh my gosh, there's still more. This is a really long chapter. Sorry. Intelligence, that's your ability to adapt to new situations. Sir Francis Galton studied it. He thought genius was hereditary, but he only studied rich people. He promoted eugenics, selective breeding. That was bad. Alfred Binet came up with the first intelligence test, the Simone Binet IQ intelligence test, which determined the idea that you can have a mental age that's different from your physical age. That was adapted to become the Stanford Binet test by Lewis Terman, and he came up with the IQ, the intelligence quotient, which is your mental age divided by your chronological age times 100. If your mental age is greater than your chronological age, you're going to have an above average IQ. If your mental age is below your chronological age, you'll have a below average IQ. Currently used today, the WAISC, the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, and the WISC, Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children. Those are modern IQ tests. Other things, we have intelligence, aptitude, and achievement tests. Aptitude measures your potential. Achievement measures what you've already learned. The AP test is an achievement test, seeing that you learned everything you should have in Psych. Tests, we look at if they're standardized, reliable, and valid. They're going to give it first to a representative sample to establish a normal curve. That's standardization. Also making sure that they have the same amount of time, the same setup. That's standardization. Helps establish a normal curve so you can determine where you rank amongst others. Reliability tells us that the test is consistent. Split half reliability. Did you get the same on first and second half? Yesterday, somebody literally got 33 right on the front of the mock test and 33 right on the back. That means the test had good split half reliability. It was consistent. Test retest says if you take the test more than once, you're going to get about the same score unless you do something different, like study more. Generally, your scores go up because you've been alive and you learned more. Generally, for a test to be considered reliable, it has to have a correlation coefficient of 0.7 or higher. Validity is, does the test measure what it is supposed to measure or predict? Content validity, if it's a Unit 5 test, it has Unit 5 information. Predictive validity, if it says you're going to be a good pilot, do you actually become a good pilot? It tells how good the test and the program was. Construct validity measures hypothetical concepts. So, for example, for measuring extroversion, to measure that test, we want to compare it to a bunch of other tests that measured similar constructs. Intelligence, general intelligence. Charles Spearman, Spearman's G. He said that all of the people are smart at one thing, tend to be smart at everything. That's general intelligence. In contrast was multiple intelligences. Howard Gardner said we have lots of types of intelligence: spatial, visual, musical, linguistic, logical. Sternberg's theory says that we have analytical intelligence. That's like book smarts, intelligence test. Creative, when you can come up with new ideas. Or practical intelligence, which is street smarts. Divergent, convergent thinking, we already said that. To be creative, generally need to have some expertise, imaginative thinking, intrinsic motivation in a creative environment. Emotional intelligence, your ability to both perceive, understand, and use emotions. Raymond Cattell, he identified fluid and crystallized intelligence. fluid increases into middle adulthood and then goes away. Mine's starting to go downhill. It's harder for me to learn new things like technology. But my crystallized intelligence, before that, said IQ scores are generally stable by about age 9, which that's why they give kids IQ tests starting in like kindergarten and first grade. The Flynn effect says that over time, IQ scores have gradually increased in developed countries, usually because of better educated parents, technology, and better schools. You're welcome. Let's see. As far as how much of your IQ is innate, studies show that 50 to 72% of your IQ is due to genes. The reaction range theory says that your environment has a role, that in a poor environment, that when you're in a deprived environment, people usually end up in their lower end of their reaction range. In a enriched environment, they end up in the higher part of their reaction range. Get your kids in the best environment possible. Stereotype threat is when you believe it's a self-confirming or self-fulfilling bias. You believe you're going to be judged by a negative stereotype, and then you perform poorly to self-confirm that. Usually affects females and minorities. That's the entire chapter. Oh my gosh, that was a whole period. Okay, so cognition, that was a long one, but we will finish up tomorrow. How do I stop this?